23 years married. Steve couldn't believe what happened in this marriage compared to his expectations. They were traditional happy. Laura had numerous strengths as a wife and mother. Both graduated and started careers after marrying in college. They still had time to have 2 great kids, both of whom were independent. Laura was a good wife and mother, except for one thing most men enjoy: the bedroom. She was gentle, cheerful, and conservative. He went down on her in their first year of marriage after drinking cheap wine with pals. Laura kicked him away. She said it's filthy. The deed itself. They played some before marrying. Steve wasn't her first partner, she had many. But one was awful. She never discussed it, saying it was a mistake for years. Personal life. Did it have to be vanilla? So dull. They partied on their houseboat with pals one night. Mike and Debbie are fun. After meeting in LeMay's courses for their first children, the 4 became close friends. This couple was different. Mike's modest businesses kept him traveling and having fun. Debbie was a bookkeeper at a neighborhood parts store with several men. Debbie and Laura shared similar traits. Debbie was 5', Laura an inch taller. Both females were lovely and conservative as young mothers. Mike would tease Debbie about her history before they met after college when they were relaxed at one of their residences after the kids went to bed. Debbie was a wild child in college. But Debbie would shush him and finish it. Mike and Steve occasionally went out for drinks or golf. Mike would say he married Debbie because she was a wild child. But kids altered everything. One of Mike's small businesses took off. They moved across the country to Seattle to manage the new venture. They all agreed to stay in touch and see each other often, and they did in the first 2 years. Like many long-distance friendships, it ended in Christmas cards and high school graduation announcements. When Laura called Steve at work, guess who was coming for a long visit? She read the letter aloud. Mike had business in a nearby city, so Debbie, who no longer worked, could come early and visit for several days. If Steve and Laura could get away the following weekend. Mike had a wonderful property on Lake Renton so they could be together. Steve was quite excited about it. Mike from work called him a few years back, unbeknownst to Laura. Mike requested lunch while traveling. After some reminiscing, Steve could see Mike was on edge. Even after years, Steve, you can read me. Mike grinned stiffly. Mike confessed when Steve pressured. Despite many temptations on the journey, he had managed to resist. I returned home last weekend to find Mike's voice in his throat and a strange automobile in our driveway. At first, I thought it was a college acquaintance visiting the kids. He heard game room noises downstairs when he unlocked the front door. Mike spun his drink and remarked. The sounds were sexual, so I believed one of the boys was down there with a girl. Since my bedroom was quiet, I wanted to see what one of my sons was getting. I saw Debbie naked, he whispered. Some enormous dude. Very large dude. They did it with her on her stomach on the pool table. Steve was amazed. Despite her earlier hints, Debbie was as straightforward as Laura, including her wish to maintain a respectable personal life. Steve asked. You did what, man? Mike gulped back tears as I stood on the stairs and watched. Steve murmured. Is that all? Mike drank a long gin and tonic and asked the waitress for another. No, he whispered quietly. Around that moment, Debbie moaned and yelled, Jesus, Steve. She's never uttered the term like this to me before. You confronted her? Steve reached for his bud as his voice dwindled. I stood, Guy. Mike's voice was shaking as I watched him with my wife. They finished as I watched. The description made Steve shake. He saw Debbie do that in his imagination and imagined another lady doing it. His wife, Laura. The hush was thick. Mike's voice shook. Don't tell Laura, she'll call Debbie. Steve nodded, thinking, heck, what would I tell her? He pondered what occurred after their previous conversation, till this call to his wife. Now they were visiting, and Steve wondered if Mike had ignored his wife's infidelity. The concept that had haunted Steve may also trick a fool. Steve remembered. Recall the 2 couples and kids' years-old journey. A wonderful old ramshackle property with loads of private beach for the kids to play on and room for everyone. Steve and Debbie realized they were night owls then. The second night, they laughed as they sent their spouses to bed and sat on the terrace overlooking the lake, listening to the waves as their kids slept inside. Debbie's nightshirt didn't bother Steve until she got up to buy them a beer. Steve could see through her shirt when she returned to the deck and passed in front of the light. 2 hours passed while they chatted. Maybe it was the 3 or 4 beers, but Steve wondered whether she had been as crazy as she said in college. She sat silently and said, possibly. Steve persisted, and she laughed. I was AS in college. Steve saw the shirt was now high on her thighs as she stroked her silky legs. Steve wondered what the S, and said, describe your worst act. She laughed again, but Steve sat calmly and said nothing. He discovered that waiting got Debbie to talk. Debbie crossed her legs and laughed. Her thighs were barely covered by the awful garment. Waited longer. Do not tell anyone. She laughed and drank more beer. He promised not. Do not disturb her sitting. I didn't tell Mike either. Really? Steve grinned. Okay, tell me. Silence. Debbie grumbled and started, a college party. I imagine it got wild, she continued, whirling the drink against her chest. She said some people were pairing off and going upstairs for what? Steve smiled. We told Ball back then. That's true. Debbie looked at him. Others stayed downstairs in the great den, she said. Despite wanting to leave, I was with Kyle, who seemed thoughtful. As she persisted, I consented to stay. People were making out below, but Kyle could kiss, she whispered, wistfully, her voice fading. Jesus, she's doing it, Steve thought as her left hand slipped under her shirt. Debbie softly continued as he kissed me and removed my halter top. Even in the dimly lit area, everyone downstairs could see. He kept kissing me despite my efforts. Steve was astonished by Debbie's right bottle grasp. He took my shorts off, she replied, her voice low and harsh. She continued, God, I looked around and saw that everyone was watching me. I got up to get my clothing, but that boy kissed me again and I melted. Despite everyone watching, Steve's voice croaked with emotion and heat. Yeah, Debbie said, he. Could see her now. She had pushed the little night shirt up, and I knew I liked them watching, both guys and girls. And someone called me AS. From across the room about the same time, an S. Suddenly there was another guy at my feet. God. Then I finished. Everybody was close and watching it. Debbie was in another world, she had dropped her beer. Oh God, and then, Debbie practically was mewing her words now. Debbie then shuddered and moaned softly. Oh God damn, oh yes. Debbie moaned as Steve heard the unmistakable sound of Debbie finishing. Steve sat quietly, overwhelmed by what he saw. She stared at Steve for a second and whispered, please don't tell. Steve nodded his head but realized he hadn't spoken. His voice shaking, he said, I promise. Debbie jumped up and raced back into the beach house. But as she went by him, Steve could smell her scent. He got up and went over to the chair where she had sat. The doorbell rang and Laura leaped off the couch and bounded toward the door. She had been looking through some old pictures of the two couples when the kids were small and realized just how much she missed her old friends. She wondered if Debbie looked a lot different. After all, they were now both in their late 40s. Laura looked in the mirror in the entryway as she passed it. Okay, a little extra, she thought as she saw herself. She opened the door to see her long-lost friend, Debbie, grinning from ear to ear. She looked so good, even a bit sexier than when they were young. Debbie had a great figure. The two women fell into each other's arms, hugging, and a few tears were shed. Before they managed to get Debbie's 2 bags up to her room, and they were back on the couch, sipping wine and talking like no time had passed. But time had passed, and as they talked, Laura felt the difference. Debbie had changed. She was a bit of tease in her conversation, talking about men like they were, what, a plaything? Laura avoided personal questions from her friend about she and Steve. That was personal, not to be shared. What does that mean? Debbie frowned. Does that mean you don't do it? Debbie. Laura blushed. Really, that language is not necessary. We have a perfectly acceptable love life. Acceptable love life? Debbie mimicked. How dreadful. Laura looked sharply at her old friend, but Debbie sipped her wine and crossed her legs under her on the couch and grinned at her friend. Laura just shook her head and laughed. You are still just such a flirt, girl. She laughed at her friend. Oh, not just a flirt. Debbie laughed and went back to her room to get a present for Laura. Laura wondered what that meant but had little time to think when her friend bounded back into the room with a little package. For letting me stay over a couple of days, she smiled. Laura smiled and opened the package. She clearly wasn't expecting what she found. It was a little bathing suit. It had a fairly small little top which wouldn't hide much. I have no idea who you bought this for, but I'm not going to be seen in public in this. Laura shot at her friend. Debbie smiled. Well, I wouldn't think so, she smiled and told her it was for just being with Steve. I don't think this is appropriate for a husband and wife either, Laura puffing. Please don't say that. Debbie told her pal. Laura stored this away without telling her pal since she knew she would never wear it. They continued talking about everything and sipping more wine. Steve was surprised when he arrived home that night. Debbie and his wife Laura were still conversing on the couch, but they were intoxicated, sloshed, or out of control. Very unlike her, Laura stood up and hugged and kissed Steve. Debbie rose up shakily and joined in, saying drunkenly, "Don't I get a kiss?" "I'm guest." Debbie entered after Laura bowed. Steve didn't think this was a good idea and put his flat hands out to stop her, but she kept coming and pushed herself into his hands, then wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him hard. His hands were now against his chest. Jesus wondered, what's happening on? Steve was shocked that they got inebriated in the middle of the week when he broke the kiss, but both women smiled and said they'd see him on the deck. Laura hissed, make us a strong set of margaritas, baby. After you get comfortable. Steve showered and changed. He wore cozy shorts and a knit shirt. Steve was proud of his years-long fitness, even though his wife's coldness in the bedroom made it irrelevant. He went out on the deck a few minutes later to see the two old pals swinging on the canopy. He smiled at the sight. Everything seemed to have vanished, and the two women were like young wives again. Their small sundresses were pulled high on their thighs. Seeing Debbie on that beach balcony reminded him of that sunny night years ago. So, are you giving us beverages or just staring? His eyes showed her something she hadn't seen in a while. Lust. Her thoughts replayed the word, wondering if he was after her or Debbie. The pitcher of margaritas was consumed while the conversation proceeded. Steve didn't realize the females were drunk after drinking 3 bottles of wine. Somehow, revisiting family details, college graduations, and new employment of the grown kids brought back the old days before kids. Debbie sighed and extended her legs. Maybe we're back to that stage, but her voice ceased. Steve pressed her foot. He was sitting near her in the old deck chair when she shifted and her sundress caught in the swing's mechanism and slid up her outside thigh. With each languid swing, she caught more material on her thigh. He was amazed she didn't notice until he noticed her hand in her lap and her dress still covering her. The cloth wrapped well into the small mechanism after a few seconds, and the dress began to slide higher till it cleared her underwear, and she was exposed up to her stomach. The dress started pulling away from her body as the flimsy fabric tore. She tried to jump up, but the mechanism shredded the material. Debbie's delicate dress peeled off in seconds, sending her twirling sideways till she fell into Steve's lap and was forced into his face. His free hand extended out to halt their fall, but Debbie hit herself and Steve's fingers, and his body fell on her. It takes time to disconnect. She stood up from the deck after another minute, her eyes unfocused and inebriated, her lips open and stared at Steve. Laura came to her senses most in this small occurrence and grabbed her pal by the hand and ran back inside. Steve stood in the deck's growing darkness for a while. Memory returned. He remembered the taste and smell of that night. He grinned briefly and whispered, "Damn it." While rushing Debbie around the home, Laura kept staring at her pal. Debbie grabbed the wash basin with both hands and exclaimed, "Wow," laughing wildly. Laura recognized 2 things in her friend's reflection immediately. First, her companion had a distinct chest bite mark. Second, Debbie's face flushed without fear or worry. It appeared excited. "Are you okay?" Laura said, putting her hand on her friend's back. "Wow." Debbie repeated, "I don't think anything like that has ever happened to me before." Laura shook her head. "Well, I hope not. That was a nasty fall, and it must be terribly embarrassing for your dress to tear off you like that." Debbie giggled again. "Yeah, most of the time I have to tear it off. Not some swing." She giggled and fell against her friend. Laura." Debbie smiled. "What are you doing?" Laura grasped it and showed it to her friend. "Well, it is a little tender from where Steve bit it." Debbie giggled again. "He bit you. Why would he?" Laura began, but she saw her friend watching her in the mirror. Watching because Laura was still holding Debbie, and she was rolling it over and over. Laura?" Debbie spoke quietly. "That's nice, but don't you think?" "Oh, I'm so sorry." Laura jumped back. "I don't know." Debbie laughed. "Baby, that's okay, but I think we need to take it a little slower." Laura blushed again, and then saw her friend's smiling face and she relaxed. "Kidding me?" Laura laughed. "You're always teasing me." Debbie smiled and undressed. Laura looked stunned as her friend did so. "Why?" she sputtered. "To check myself." Debbie giggled, as she turned sideways to see the very clear red spot spreading over her, and Laura did see the red bruise. Are you okay back there?" Laura almost whispered, trying to focus on, but her eyes kept going down. "Yeah, back here." Debbie pointed to redirect Laura's eyes. "Damn. I don't think it has been that red since the last time Mike spanked me." Laura's mouth flew open. "He spanked you? My God, did you report him?" Debbie broke up laughing. "Well, no, I like when Mike spanks me. A lot." Her eyes gleamed. "But why does he do that?" Laura's hand brushed lightly over Debbie. "Well, for fun mostly, but sometimes cause I need to be disciplined, and I love when he disciplines me." Laura's hand lay softly on Debbie. Her eyes looking at Debbie in the mirror like she didn't know who she was. Why do you let him do it?" Debbie put her hand on Laura's face. "Because I love him to do it." That last statement overwhelmed Laura, and she sat down on the toilet seat in shock. What else does he do to you?" she said quietly, her voice almost disappearing at her friend's confession. "Oh, we can talk about this later." Debbie laughed and bounded off to her room to find a change of clothes. A few minutes later, they all gathered in the kitchen. Steve was still flushed from the experience of a few minutes ago, Laura was still flushed from seeing her friend and her statement. And Debbie, well, Debbie began thinking that this night was just beginning. Debbie had put on a big t-shirt, and moreover she knew that she was hoping that she would eventually be getting this one ripped off tonight as well. The conversation tried to resume where they left off, but somehow the events of the past few minutes were hanging in the air. It was Debbie, of course, that decided to confront them. You know, Steve. She smiled. Ma, you didn't have to throw me on the ground like that. Steve blushed and Laura looked away nervous at this statement. God, she laughed, you did wonderful. He did what? Laura said softly. That wasn't my fault. Steve reached for a new wine bottle and you hit me. I felt where I landed, she laughed. Steve was shocked by what she said as I reached for my jewels. He felt Debbie push against him as she rubbed herself into his chest as they laughed. She laughed and retreated. Even though Steve was amazed, he kept mocking. Debbie laughed again and grabbed Steve's opened wine bottle. She eagerly drank it without a glass. She drank a healthy swig as Steve and Laura watched. She grinned as she handed Laura the bottle. Debbie and Steve stared at Laura as she took a deep gulp from the bottle due to her uneasiness at the talk. Debbie's lower lip was out. Fake a pout, you didn't catch me and now it's red. She swayed it at him. Steve laughed and threw the shirt end high, landing in her back. The red mark spread when she was exposed. Damn, Steve stated. Debbie did not cover or move from Steve and Laura staring at her. Steve couldn't resist delicately touching the crimson spot. Ouch. Debbie jerked and dropped the shirt. His touch didn't hurt her. But she took another approach. I may need lotion. Are there any, Laura? In the kitchen medicine cabinet, Laura spotted a small container of soothing lotion. Please put it on for me. Debbie murmured as she leaned over the kitchen table and carefully threw the shirt over her back. Her feet were far apart. After Steve froze, Laura poured lotion on him and rubbed it. That feels fantastic, Debbie said. A little lower, done. Now shaking, she whispered. Laura kept rubbing and lotioning. Laura grabbed the bottle and took another long drink after Steve took 2 more heavy drinks. She laughed, but Debbie murmured. A bit more, lower. Debbie grabbed Laura's wrist and directed it after Laura applied lotion. Debbie lied face down on the kitchen table. Oh yes, Debbie whispered. Laura couldn't stop. Yes, Debbie bucked slightly. Laura recoiled in terror at her actions when the motion stopped. She ran from the kitchen to her bedroom, leaving her companion in front of Steve, her husband. Steve watched his wife leave down the corridor. Looked down at Debbie. He knew to visit his wife. He knew it was right. He no longer cared about right as he reached for Debbie.